Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
So thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this event. Well, as you can see from the title, what I'm going to talk about is primarily about Europe, although I did spend a walkout already. I did spend the morning at what is now called IRCC, used to be CIC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and my wider project, which the logo is there on the slide, MIGPROSP, funded by the European Research Council, is a comparison of Europe, North America, South America and Asia Pacific, looking at the drivers of migration governance, not the reasons why people move, but how actors within governance systems understand this movement and what that means for the future development of governance systems. So that's the wider project. In terms of convergence, I'm primarily going to be focused on the current situation in Europe and what could be called a fragmentation of the European migration governance system. I think that Europe has been kind of overwhelmed by the current situation. When it comes to kind of questions around admission, I'm not sure there is very much convergence between Canada and the European Union. Canada's key relationships in migration are with what's called the Five-Country Conference, the United States, New Zealand, Australia and the UK, major destination countries who meet frequently, share ideas and information, and that collaboration is actually quite important. Transatlantic collaborations on migration are often focused on border security questions, but maybe I think in the area of integration we may see some different dynamics. And as Oliver said, obviously the kind of questions of levels of governance is crucial, and in my own work what I've tried to do is think about the way in which the kind of networks of governance are constituted. So not only governmental actors, the kind of formal structures of regional governance, but also processes of regionalisation, which is a broader process that involves a wider range of actors, international organisations, business interests, think tanks. So to think about those kind of dynamics and the kind of trans-governmental dynamics. The political dynamics, as Oliver said, are also crucial. I'm going to talk about those. Kind of populist politics in Europe, which have been labelled, I think, quite significantly as a new cultural divide in European politics, and I'll talk about that and its implications a little later. But I think also it is important when talking about the EU to be specific about what the EU is doing in migration. And one thing that is absolutely fundamental is the EU has no authority when it comes to numbers of migrants to be admitted. That is strictly a matter for the member states by treaty. So admissions, there's some very weak coordination around admissions, but the key issue, admissions policy, in a way the core business of immigration, is a matter for the member states. So really that's kind of introducing what I'm going to talk about. And fundamentally the argument is there's a big disjunction between the drivers of migration, the factors that are causing people to move, and the drivers of migration politics in EU member states, how the responses to this movement are then linked to political dynamics in Europe. And to kind of go back to Oliver's point, really, I think it is important to recognise that international migration is simultaneously a societal and an international issue. Connections must be made across those levels. It's necessarily a kind of multi-level issue. There are relations between sending and receiving countries, which are obviously fundamental to kind of international migration relations that develop. And if we think about those kind of looking at the drivers of migration, then the key drivers of migration are economic, relative economic inequalities, political, particularly conflict within or between states, social, which are the effects of networks and the kind of the ties that bind migrants, often within transnational diasporic communities, demographic factors, and we've the kind of a relationship between demographic trends in Europe and what it calls its neighbourhood and beyond its neighbourhood are important, as well as kind of environmental factors and effects of environmental and climate change potentially on migration, although avoiding some of the kind of more apocalyptic projections of climate refugees. But I think there is interest and evidence which suggests that there is an important relationship between environmental change and migration through interaction with these other drivers. Internally, the drivers of migration politics, I think, are very closely linked to a breakdown in trust in political leaders and political institutions in Europe. And Lauren McLaren at the University of Glasgow has called this a cultural divide in European politics. And I think this is a crucial dynamic in European politics. Those who are least likely to trust political institutions and political leaders are also likely to oppose immigration and be Eurosceptic. And so you see across Europe the rise of populist, right-wing, anti-immigration Eurosceptic parties who don't coalesce into one neat grouping, but is a significant dynamic across the European Union and has important effects on political leaders in the EU who look nervously over their shoulders at these groups. And I think what that is causing is a fundamental disjunction and potentially a fragmentation of European migration governance along the lines that Oliver was talking about, the reimposition of controls, so the breakdown of Europe's internal mobility system, as well as more fundamental questions about the commitment to the kind of objectives that were originally agreed to in the European treaties. So just to provide you with some information, because I'm assuming not everybody here is a migration expert, but this is the data produced by the IOM on their, what they call their Missing Migrants project. And if you look at it, it's probably the most depressing website because of the unfolding tragedy. So far this year, 444 men, women and children are reported dead or missing. That's so far this year, 3,700 last year. In the first, 9 weeks or so, 141,000 arrivals, which is much higher than at this time last year. And you can see that predominantly that's through this kind of Eastern Mediterranean corridor, which has been the focus for much attention by EU leaders, looking at their relationship between Turkey, Greece, and then what's called the Balkan route, which EU leaders this week claim they are going to close, the Balkan route as they call it, although previous experience will suggest that new routes may well open. But these kind of figures are kind of part of the everyday discussion of migration in Europe. Huge numbers of arrivals. Of course, it could be slightly misleading because, of course, hundreds of thousands of people arrive perfectly normally through air and seaports. So this isn't the picture of all migration to Europe. But the refugee crisis in terms of its scale, 1 million arrivals last year, 850,000 through Greece, has placed enormous stress on governance systems with limited capacity to respond to that. And these are the kind of maps that develop. And I think there's a couple of interesting points about these maps. They show you the routes, but I also think, and well, it reminds me a little bit of those who are from Britain might have some familiarity with cultural reference, but I'll explain it. There's a program on British TV called Dad's Army, which is about what's called the Home Guard in the Second World War. They were the kind of elderly men who volunteered to defend the home front from a German invasion. And the opening credits for that program showed these arrows with the little swastika pointing from Europe towards the British Isles. And I think sometimes these maps of migrants remind me a little bit. They give this kind of idea of invasion, of arrows pointing towards Europe along which migrants are moving. And Hein de Haas at the University of Amsterdam has I think, kind of burst this idea of a myth of invasion, the idea that Europe is being invaded by migrants. So these kind of maps, I think, are interesting in that they do represent an important dynamic in migration, but we should also think about how they're used and how they're interpreted. And what I've found in the research I've been doing is that they feed into the idea that pull factors in Europe, the attractiveness of European countries is drawing migrants towards Europe. And if you accept that idea that it's a pull factor in Europe, it then feeds quite neatly into ideas about deterrence. What you need then to do is remove these pull factors. Maybe build fences, build walls, remove entitlement to social benefits, make life more difficult for migrants. So in Britain, it's very clear that the government wants to create a hostile environment. We know that because they say they want to create a hostile environment for migrants. So we want to find divergence between Canada and Europe. You know, the idea that in Canada that there'll be any interest in creating a hostile environment for migrants, it's just patently absurd. But in Europe, this idea of a hostile environment for migrants is something that has a lot of currency amongst political leaders. Also think there's a perception that things are changing. This is an interview I did with a European Union official working in one of its agencies responsible for borders. And what's interesting here, well, this was a meeting between the US, the European Commission and others, and I've just highlighted a bit in bold. They, these senior officials, are repeatedly mentioning that this will be the new normal. 250,000 to 280,000 irregular migrants a year. That's basically what we have to count on in the foreseeable future. Nothing will change in this regard. And I think the idea here is that something has changed. Something needs to be done in response to this change. European leaders have found it incredibly difficult to respond, to come up with any kind of collective agreement or display any form of solidarity. So they did agree, for instance, to relocate asylum applicants from Greece, Italy and Hungary. I think ambitious targets were set, 150,000 people, and I think around 600 so far have been relocated. So some agreement, but then impossible to put it into play, into practice. But I think there's this idea that something has changed, that something quite significant is happening, and that these drivers of migration, economic, political, demographic, environmental and social, are going to lead to continued pressure on Europe's borders, and that something must be done. And this is a quote from the Austrian Foreign Minister, Sebastian Kurz. And I think this plays into this idea of deterrence, that migrants are coming to Europe because of its attractiveness. And so what you want to do is, in a way, to try and deter this. So as you say here, they come here because they want to enjoy the living standards and benefits they're guaranteed in countries like Austria, Germany or Sweden. And you will say, well, actually, many of the migrants, it's many people kind of fleeing persecution and conflict may not be coming for benefits, but it feeds into this idea that things like benefits are a pull factor that migrants are attracted by, and that also that migrants then are abusing the kind of hospitality of European countries. So he says, don't get me wrong, I don't blame these people. I can understand them because many politicians have triggered false hopes. Many politicians, of course, is just a reference to Angela Merkel. German politicians would be the word for many politicians. So I think this idea of deterrence is becoming, certainly this is just picking out one particular quote, but a lot of the interviews we've been doing, and we've interviewed a lot of people in Europe, European governments, European Commission and other places as well, this idea of pull factors, that Europe is attractive. You need to make Europe less attractive by making life more difficult for migrants once they arrive, but also, of course, making it more difficult for them to get in the first place. And just to give a sense of the underlying dynamics, why this might be, well, the first quote is from, well, it's called Think Tank Representative, but a very influential global think tank who really are close to a lot of governments. And in bold there, you have politicians who are terrified that the next move they make is going to see them out of office. The kind of political toxicity of migration should not be underestimated, and the fear that this induces, which again, in relation to Canada, is completely different. I don't think it's anywhere near the kind of this toxic component of the debate about migration in Europe, and the fear that it can induce amongst political leaders, and what that then means for policy in terms of it being kind of rather reactive and very much structured by ideas about crisis. And the second quote underneath it, I think I've deleted who that's actually from. That's from well, he's a very senior official in the European Commission who pointed to what he saw as a key issue in current debates in Europe, which is the rise of populist and extreme right-wing political parties, who some of them have been around for a while, some of them are relatively new, they're not necessarily coherent. But this idea that perceptions and the perceptions of European publics have changed, it is much more difficult to master, that something significant has happened in the politics of Europe. And of course, the European Commission has no capacity to deal with this, because for those who oppose immigration, the European Commission is part of the problem. The European Union itself has very little ability to intervene in any authoritative way in these debates about immigration, because for those who are opposed to immigration, they often combine that with very strong Euroscepticism. The crisis has also fractured the kind of internal dynamics of the European Union. So This is a quote from a member of a delegation of an EU member state, one of the smaller member states, but referring to what was called like-mindedness. And like-mindedness was an important dynamic. And so this is a good example of it. There are plenty of others where the officials of the like-minded member states, Austria, Sweden, Germany, the UK, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, will discuss what we should say, how we should react at the following meeting, trying to get a common approach to the issue. Because on this issue, we think more the same in a lot of other countries. But this like-mindedness is fragmented. You know, it's not clear that Britain's going to remain a member state of the European Union, though I'm pretty sure it will, if anybody would like. I'm not going to discuss Brexit, but I'd be amazed if Britain left the European Union. But that's introduced a fracture into this kind of like-minded dynamics. Austria and Germany, there are tensions. Denmark has been involved too, but Denmark is seen as a bit beyond the pale because some of its some of the domestic developments in Denmark. So it's affected some of the internal dynamics within the European migration governance system and some of these dynamics around like-mindedness. So in terms of to bring it together with some kind of final thoughts and really reflect on some of the developments we've seen this week as well as some of the wider points, I think the structure for this is that, you know, we talk about a migration crisis or refugee crisis in Europe, but I think you could equally see it as a crisis of politics. You know, there are 2.5 million refugees and migrants in Turkey, 3.5 million if you look at Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. There are maybe, you know, the numbers in Europe are smaller in a bloc of 500 million people. And as Angela Merkel put it at one time, we can manage, but Europe can't manage. I think that's as much a crisis of politics as it is a crisis of migration and refugees, and I think that's kind of important because obviously the word crisis, you know, and the identification of a crisis is, you know, is kind of a is kind of politically politically defined, and the way that it is defined will obviously influence the nature of a response. So this week, an allegedly game-changing deal with Turkey was arrived at, which is inconsistent with Europe's previous attempts to kind of externalise the response, and of course is highly significant in terms of EU-Turkish relations, the position of the Turkish government, and raises enormous questions because it could lead to the mass expulsion of people from Europe, contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights. But it's not clear that this is going to yet be agreed. So the framework of the deal is in place, but it's not yet clear that the member states themselves at the meeting on the 17th and 18th are going to agree to it. So next week, I think the European Council meets, and Agnieszka will know. Yeah. Well, and also as Oliver has said, border controls are being reimposed as a solution. Although today in the press, Angela Merkel was pointing out the border controls aren't a solution to the refugee crisis. They might actually just provide further clients for the smuggling industry and make movement towards Europe dangerous and more risky, or create what a Greek minister evocatively referred to as a warehouse of souls, people who've been displaced and live in a kind of limbo in holding camps outside the European Union or in Greece, if depending on what happens at the Greek-Macedonian border. It's also been suggested that an inner Schengen might emerge of the kind of some of the original Schengen states who trust each other. And so there's, you know, I'm not sure how much mileage there is in this, but it has been mentioned to me. They're looking at, you know, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Austria, countries that maybe would have more trust in each other's capacity to control borders, moving back to a kind of an inner Schengen. And of course, finally, as I've already said, the European immigration politics is powerfully structured by the challenges to mainstream parties coming from Eurosceptic, anti-immigration parties on the populist and extreme right. And this shouldn't be underestimated as a key dynamic in European politics. These parties aren't driving the agenda, but they do have influence on mainstream parties. So mainstream parties are, of course, shaping and driving the agenda. But these parties, I do think, have pretty powerful influence on them. And some of them, of course, have actually been in government. And of course, in France next year, we'll see what happens in the presidential elections. So fundamentally, I think there are major challenges to European migration governance, and kind of points of convergence around borders and admissions are, I think, difficult to see in these rather testing times for Europe. Thank you.